pages of time and the memories of those who served, we bring you the epic stories of the most powerful and devastating war machines ever built. Welcome to Ghost Warships, where the history of naval power sails on. This episode of Ghost Warships takes you back in time to a cold night in the Pacific Ocean during the Second World War. As battles raged on all corners of the Earth, two powerful naval forces sailed towards each other, intent on leveraging their firepower to gain an advantage in the quest for victory. The Empire of Japan had been escalating their campaign for total dominance in the Pacific, while the United States was making every effort to prevent it. A section of the Solomon Islands called Guadalcanal was a strategic imperative due to its location and geography, where multiple sea routes connected vast oceanic territories. In addition, an airfield called Henderson Field was critical to extending the reach of air power for Japan and the United States. On a cold night in November 1942, the Second Battle of Guadalcanal would go down in history as one of only two battleship versus battleship engagements during the Second World War. Following the end of World War I, the Empire of Japan had significant restrictions placed on its naval power and military capabilities. The Washington Naval Treaty banned Japan from building any capital ships until 1931, and those were not to exceed 35,000 tons. At that time, the Imperial Japanese Navy had only 3 classes of World War I-era capital ships, including the formidable Kongo-class battlecruisers. As Japan set its sights on expanding its empire, it initiated hostilities in the quest for power and territory. In 1934, Japan formally denounced the Washington Naval Treaty and began to ramp up its military, including improvements to its existing capital ships in an effort to strengthen its naval forces. The battleship Kirishima was initially built as the third and final battlecruiser in the Kongo class and was named after a group of active volcanoes rising 5,100 feet over Japan called Kirishima Yama, which translated means Kirishima Mountains. Designed by British naval engineer George Thurston, her keel was laid down in 1912 at the Mitsubishi shipyards in Nagasaki. She was formally commissioned in 1915. Over time, the Japanese initiated improvements to Kirishima in order to bring her up to par with foreign naval powers and to ensure her capabilities matched the other military vessels in her growing naval force. Leading up to the Second Sino-Japanese War of Aggression, the Kirishima had its enhanced modifications completed with improvements in her armor, guns, control systems, and propulsion. She was now capable of increased speeds so that she could sail with Japan's growing aircraft carrier fleet. She was also equipped with launch catapults for float planes and had the distinctive pagoda-style superstructure installed. With these enhancements, she was now classified as a fast battleship. The Kirishima sailed as part of the battle group supporting the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, starting the United States' involvement and entrance into the Second World War. By this time, the Kirishima's battle configuration included the following. The Kirishima weighed 37,187 tons. She was 728 feet long and could travel 35 miles an hour for 10,000 nautical miles. She was manned by 1,360 sailors. Her armament included 8 14-inch guns, each weighing 84.6 tons that could fire projectiles weighing 1,485 pounds, 22 miles at a rate of 2 per minute. She also had 16 6-inch guns, 8 5-inch guns, and a significant complement of anti-aircraft weapons. Her armor belt was between 8 and 10 inches thick, and the armor on her gun turrets was 9 inches thick. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States remained a neutral party to the conflict and hostilities brewing on the world stage. However, seeing the potential for battles surpassing the devastation of World War I, the United States engaged in an aggressive and expedited quest to improve its naval presence and overall military strength, including development, design, and build-out of some of the most powerful battleships ever to sail. One area of focus was the need for a navy with gunships capable of intense firepower combined with high speed and thick armor. This prompted the design of the North Carolina-class battleships. These battleships had some of the strongest armor, best power plants, and most powerful guns ever mounted on a warship. The USS Washington was the second in her class, and her keel was laid down in 1938. She was fitted out and completed in May 1941. Her initial design called for 9 14-inch main guns per the Second London Naval Treaty, but when Japan failed to sign this treaty, the U.S. was allowed to invoke a special clause, enabling the main battery to increase to 9 16-inch guns. The USS Washington's battle configuration included the following. The battleship Washington weighed 36,000 tons and was 728 feet long. She could travel 32 miles per hour at a range of 17,450 nautical miles. She was manned by 1,800 sailors. Her armament included 9 16-inch guns, each weighing 133 tons that could fire a 2,700-pound projectile at a rate of 2 per minute, 29 miles. She also had 20 5-inch guns and a significant complement of anti-aircraft weapons. Her armor belt was 12 inches thick, and the armor on her gun turrets was 16 inches thick. While the Empire of Japan was attempting to conquer much of the Pacific territory, it eventually focused its naval power on Guadalcanal. On November 10, 1942, Kirishima set sail with her sister ship the Hiei and 11 destroyers on course to bombard Guadalcanal in advance of a major transport convoy of Japanese troops. The effort was designed to take this territory, including land-based areas where aircraft could then be deployed to extend the reach and firepower of the Japanese military. The American naval forces were aware of these advances and sent a substantial battle group to engage the Japanese warships. In the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, the American task force that was in the area with the help of Navy reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese fleet. 2 heavy cruisers and 3 light cruisers with 8 destroyers were sent to intercept the larger and more powerful Japanese force in an area called Iron Bottom Sound. On Friday, November 13th, a chaotic and destructive night battle took place at extremely close range. Initially, the focus of the United States ships was on the battleship Hiei, while the Japanese used a series of well-rehearsed night fighting tactics to attack the U.S. warships. The 2 battle groups exchanged heavy fire, inflicting significant damage and taking out multiple ships on each side. In some cases, the Japanese ships were within 20 feet of the American ships. During the battle, multiple hits were scored on the Japanese task force by the USS San Francisco, USS Helena, and several American destroyers. In return, both the Hiei and Kirishima bombarded the San Francisco and Helena with 14-inch rounds. Multiple shells tore into the bridge at the San Francisco, killing U.S. Admiral Daniel Callahan. As the fighting continued, the battleship Hiei was eventually hit by multiple American salvos, destroying her control systems and damaging her propulsion and steering. Eventually, she was unable to fight. Reeling from the battle with significant damage and loss of life, the remaining ships of the 2 naval forces pulled back to regroup. As a result of this engagement, the Admiralty of the U.S. Navy decided to strengthen the U.S. forces with the addition of the battleships USS South Dakota and USS Washington, with the intent to engage the Japanese forces, protect Guadalcanal, and defend Henderson Field. 2 days after the first battle, the Japanese forces maneuvered into the Solomon Islands and positioned themselves in Iron Bottom Sound. The U.S. task force tracked the Japanese with advanced radar and maneuvered their ships into position. Just before midnight, on November 14th, the 2 fleets engaged in another violent naval battle. In the darkness, the Kirishima and heavy cruiser Otago illuminated the South Dakota with their searchlights and immediately began sending rounds towards their target. At over 2,500 feet per second, the shells began to pound on the American battleship, inflicting over 24 direct hits, killing 40 and wounding another 180 crew. With explosive impacts, the 14-inch shells of the Kirishima hammered into the armor of the South Dakota, causing extensive damage. At least 3 of the 14-inch salvos slammed into her secondary battery and superstructure, knocking out the fire control systems and communications, crippling her radar and gun batteries in their entirety, leaving the South Dakota incapable of returning fire. The South Dakota was under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee, and one can only imagine his perceptions as the battleship was getting rocked by impacts. He described the damage inflicted on the South Dakota by the Japanese, saying that it left his powerful war machine deaf, dumb, blind, and impotent. While the crew of the Kirishima were celebrating their perceived victory and success against the battleship South Dakota, little did they realize that the celebration would be short-lived, and before they knew it, they would be fighting for their lives under catastrophic destruction. For steaming into position, unseen, intent on revenge for the attack against the South Dakota, and as a direct response to the Pearl Harbor attack, was the battleship USS Washington, with all her guns and crew ready to deliver on the promise of her construction as a weapon of war and bringer of death. After maneuvering into position, the USS Washington brought her guns to bear. From one ship to the other, in the flash of burning fires, one could see either crew working on the decks and manning their weapons. Using her advanced radar sighting system, the Washington trained the 16-inch 45 caliber Mark VI guns of her 3 turrets on the Kirishima, and a bead was drawn. Then, the order was given to open fire on the unsuspecting Japanese battleship. Shortly thereafter, at midnight, the massive flames belching from the 16-inch guns of the Washington began illuminating the ocean surface and skyline as she started hammering the Kirishima with armor-piercing rounds, each traveling 2,300 feet per second at near point-blank range. In short order, the Washington fired 75 rounds of 16-inch and 107 rounds of 5-inch projectiles towards Kirishima. The Washington immediately began scoring hits with 2,700-pound shells slamming into the Kirishima's hull and superstructure. One can only imagine the Japanese crew frantically trying to return fire while having these projectiles blasting into the ship. In the horrific moment of impact, with deafening sound and twisted wreckage, the carnage would be horrifying. In desperate conditions, the crew of the Kirishima attempted to line up her guns to respond, but the Washington's superior firepower tore into Kirishima with approximately 20 direct hits, destroying her communications and disabling her ability to fight back. There was simply no way the Kirishima could recover, and it began to take serious damage above and below the waterline. Eyewitness accounts describe the darkness of the night broken by the fire of the guns and explosive impacts on the Kirishima, highlighting the entire scene across the ocean. The crew of the South Dakota and the other U.S. sailors watching it cheered as each round fired from the Washington scored devastating hits, shattering the Kirishima's armor, sending huge fragments of the battleship into the air. As the Washington continued to hammer shells into the Kirishima, her fate was sealed. She began taking catastrophic damage to the forward magazines of her 14-inch turrets, which were flooded, causing failure to the hydraulic pumps that powered her rear 14-inch guns, leaving her unable to effectively fire back at the Washington. Hits were scored, causing damage below the waterline, and Kirishima began to list 18 degrees starboard. Her rudder was jammed, causing an uncontrollable course circling port. With each impact, the ship was rocked through the lower decks, and as fires raged, the order was given to abandon ship. This followed a set sequence where the crew first evacuated the ship's portrait of the Emperor, and then the crew itself began to escape the flaming wreck. While the Japanese and Americans reeled at the damage inflicted, they each attempted to organize their forces and focus on saving their crews and the remaining warships. Eventually, the American task force backed off to regroup, and an attempt to save the Kirishima was made by towing it, which was eventually abandoned. Soon thereafter, the Kirishima capsized and sank with the loss of 212 souls. While she disappeared below the surface, massive internal explosions in the forward magazine ripped through the bow of the ship, tearing off huge sections past the bridge. As she slammed into the ocean floor upside down, her anchor chain was wrapped around the stern of the ship, and her superstructure and gun turrets were buried under her weight as the force of the impact entombed this mighty and proud Ghost Warship, leaving her to the vast darkness of the ocean and the eternal passage of time. After the intense battle with the Kirishima, the Washington was ordered to withdraw and protect American carrier groups and task forces continuing the fight in the Solomon Islands. In 1943, she was sailed to Pearl Harbor for a major overhaul. It would be quite a sight to see this veteran of victorious combat against the Japanese sailing past the still scarred and burnt harbor, where so many U.S. sailors and ships remained after the December 7th attack. On March 24, 1945, she bombarded the Japanese island of Okinawa with her 16-inch guns in order to soften up the defenses prior to the American landings. Her firepower was instrumental in the success of these landings. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese formally surrendered, and the USS Washington's combat career came to an end. She was decommissioned on June 27, 1947, and placed into reserves. While she lay dormant, some of her 40mm anti-aircraft guns were removed and mounted on the newer Iowa-class battleships for combat during the Korean War. The Washington was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on June 1, 1960, and sold for scrap on May 24, 1961. Tragically, the USS Washington, battleship BB-56, recipient of 13 battle stars for valiant service during World War II, was towed to the Lipset Division of Luria Brothers and broken up for scrap. The IJN Kirishima has been the subject of many essays and books. Interest in her location and condition peaked when Dr. Robert Ballard, in partnership with the U.S. Navy and the National Geographic Society, located her in 1992 at a depth of 550 meters and was able to video her debris field for a short 9 minutes. This discovery inspired a second attempt to document the ship by the research team of Paul Allen. The images from this expedition by Allen's company Vulcan Inc. on January 31, 2019 showed clearly the condition of the ship and illustrated the damage, including impact holes from 16-inch rounds fired by the USS Washington. They also showed a section of the anchor chain wrapped around one of the propeller shafts and the locked rudder. Since 2019, no additional attempts to reach the Kirishima have been undertaken. When countries invest their resources into development of powerful weapons of war, invariably there will be a collision of those weapons. In the case of battleship versus battleship, the conflict is of the most destructive, yet personal. In this battle, two legendary Ghost Warships, the USS Washington and the IJN Kirishima, met and fought bravely with horrific results in terms of loss of life and the sinking of the Kirishima. Their legacy is in the history of their battles, the crew who served on them, and their status as legendary weapons of war. They will always be revered, and their legendary stories will be shared here by Ghost Warships, where the history of naval power sails on.